Hello and welcome to this KUK webinar. I'm delighted to be joined by colleagues from the National Institute for Health and Care Research, or NIHR, and they're going to walk you through some of the revenue sharing policy changes that they're introducing for higher education institutes and NHS bodies. I've got three colleagues here, James, Mark and Daniel. I think Mark's going to do a brief introduction. Daniel's going to do the main bit of talking, and then there's a chance for Q&A at the end while I'll reappear. But without further ado, I'll hand over to Mark to do a much better introduction than mine.
Thank you, Stuart, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this briefing on the new NIHR revenue sharing policy for universities and the NHS. Policy is a culmination of extensive review and consultation work and does introduce a real change in the way that NIHR handles commercial use intellectual property. The idea behind the new policy is to try and reduce bureaucracy, to reduce the burden of negotiation and communication on contractors, to increase the level of transparency, and to help facilitate faster local reinvestment of the NHS share of revenues. Before I hand over to Daniel, I do want to reiterate again, this is a significant step change, but it is a starting point. One hopes that conversations will continue. We are here to try and make this policy work in the real world and for institutions. And we hope that you will work with us so we can understand how the policy is implemented. The policy does have a level of flexibility, which is always a good idea. And that there will always be edge cases that don't fit the mold. But we now do have a much bigger intellectual property team than we used to have and systems in place. And under such circumstances, I hope that the new policy will be received positively. One of the reasons I'm here today facilitating the conversation is I was here in 2012 when I worked with Ben Patient and Glenn Wells from the Department of Health on the original intellectual property policy. And I can definitely say that this is a real step change to what we did in 2012. So, Daniel, if I can pass over to you for the presentation before we do a Q&A.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mark. Yeah, let me bring my screen up. Okay, excellent. Well, yeah, thank you again, everybody, for joining us for this briefing on the new NIHR revenue sharing policy that is specifically for universities and NHS bodies. I'm going to take you through over the next sort of 15 minutes, the key messaging that we want you to take away about this policy, why we've brought it in, explain how we've incorporated feedback through consultation over the last year. I'll briefly explain the different approaches involved in the policy, the terms of the key new approach from the policy, that is this automated approach that is supposed to reduce bureaucracy, increase the transparency of our processes and enable more revenue to be reinvested locally. And then we'll close with some key takeaways and explain how we're rolling out this policy over the next few months. So the key messaging for this policy, the purpose of this policy has been brought in to accelerate low value revenue sharing transactions for universities and the NHS. Ultimately, we want to facilitate local reinvestment of the revenue shares that the NIHR gets back into the institutions where the research is taking place, and we want to make that happen much faster than the current extended time period it takes. We need to be able to robustly justify DHSC's or the NIHR's revenue share positions in order to protect DHSC's interests, but also to promote that local reinvestment. And we've deliberately set a very high bar for use of this automated approach. So one of those key thresholds is the investment being less than £2 million. And we believe that 80% of commercial use cases that result from the NIHR will fall into that automated approach and will allow institutions to reinvest the NIHR share of revenue that comes from that commercialization. As I mentioned before, we've carried out a lot of consultation and we've worked to pragmatically soften the original ask that came from the department in consideration of TTOs and institutional needs in the current climate. And the policy has been signed off by DHSC and agreed across government with appropriate departmental ministers in review. So incorporating feedback from consultation. So there's three areas where we've really tempered DHSC's position here. So the original ask was for a cap on TTO fees. We've moved this now to guidance, a guideline of 10%. And what we do ask is that a rationale for when the TTO fee is higher than 10%, that this be provided. And this is because in the department's view, TTO fees need to be proportional to allow for maximum amount of revenue to flow back into the research. By changing this position to guidelines, we hope that this flexibility will not hinder commercialization, but we hope to work with TTOs to show that these fees are being applied proportionally. We've also aligned our accounting methodologies with the broader infrastructure, that's the NIHR BRC and plus others infrastructure, so that when trying to apportion financial contributions from those BRCs, some of you will be aware, can be very challenging. There's now one method that is being used to attribute spend from the BRCs. So we're reducing duplication of work and hopefully accelerating time to getting consent signed off and time to getting to revenue sharing. And then lastly, the ask was to introduce a default funder share. That is when consent is not sought properly or commercial use occurs without the appropriate sign-offs. And we've softened this position from what was originally a flat fee to now being a proportional position that will be assigned on a case-by-case basis, depending on the scenario. Ultimately, as custodians of public money, we need to ensure that the returns from taxpayer funding are distributed proportionally and deployed appropriately to meet key government targets. That's the real backbone to this. So, the new revenue sharing approaches. All commercial use or requests for consent and then leading into revenue sharing approaches start in the same position. They start with submission of a consent form. We've introduced a new consent form, which we believe will reduce the amount of back and forth that often happens when we are trying to get enough information out to complete our diligence. Once this form has been submitted, the process is then to assess whether this case can go down the automated approach or go down the case-by-case approach. We've set a very high bar for the case-by-case approach. So you can see these here. It's if the funding is, the NIHR funding is greater than £2 million. It's if there's an interest in providing NHS discounts. It's if there's a commercial application to a public health emergency, and lastly, if the anticipated financial return will exceed the NIHR's investment. So high value and high risk cases, essentially. For those 80% of cases that don't hit those thresholds, we expect them to go down the automated approach. Within the automated approach, what we are promising is that we will grant consent and financial revenue sharing terms within 30 days of providing that full consent form, of all the information we need to know to do our diligence. With the automated approach, it will enable the institutions to locally retain the NIHR's share of revenues every time. That's what has been pre-approved all the way up in DHSC, which means you don't have to wait for the whole delay to get that signed off. With the case-by-case approach, similar, except the revenue sharing negotiations are pushed down the road. You will still get consent granted within 30 days, but ultimately what this gives us is more flexibility and also more resource, because we have things being automated now. We can spend more time producing more interesting, more flexible, more creative deals when necessary. Also, to be clear, this is kind of what the current approach is, the case-by-case one. This is going to remain at the contractors. This is going to remain available for contractors at your discretion during this rollout period for at least 3 months as this policy beds in. So if you don't like the automated approach, if you have a real issue with it, you can still stay. You want to go down the case-by-case approach and continue with the previous practice. So in terms of the terms that come from the automated approach, the policy and the automated approach is built around the financial value of the NIHR's contribution to research. Now, we understand that inventor contribution is preferred by a number of key institutions in the community, but the challenges from the NIHR perspective is we require a tangible position for DHSC to be able to justify the revenue sharing position it ends up in. The use of inventor contribution doesn't currently actively reflect the funder's contributions to projects and can result to significant dilution that is not defensible when taken up into select committees within government. The financial terms we've broken down as follows. So the flow is a top slice of direct fees and TTO fee, Again, as I mentioned, with a rationale when exceeding that 10% guide. The funder's revenue share is then set at the NHR's financial contribution multiplied by 50%. And what we've done is we've written into the policy flexibility in the case of funders' terms clashing. So we're aware that some funders will be using investor contribution. We will flex if there are scenarios that mean that the institution will be getting less than 50%, and we're open to discussing that locally. And then finally, when going through the automated approach, the NIHR's revenue shares that have been determined by that financial contribution will then be retained locally for the institution to reinvest into health and social care research. The key benefits from this are speed, transparency, and reinvestment. You've got speed because consent and revenue sharing terms will be completed within 30 days of that full consent being requested. Transparency because you know what the terms are going to be, and reinvestment because you are going to be enabled to locally reinvest the NHR's revenue. And again, just to emphasize this, we've written in flex when our terms clash with other funders, we will work with you to make it pragmatic, to find a pragmatic solution as we go. The default funder share, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is the remedy of last resort in the event of inappropriate commercial use. So that's things like commercializing without obtaining consent, it's failure to comply with the terms of consent, and failure to provide appropriate or adequate information so that we can carry out that diligence. We will apply this funder share and use the available information, estimate if necessary, if that information isn't available, to prescribe proportional revenue sharing terms that reflect the NHR's fair contribution. So this is no longer a flat fee as was originally drafted. It is now going to be proportional to that case specific. We're also written in that the contractor can appeal and provide further info. So there's a lot of flexibility here. The goal is not to penalize or to fine. The goal is to protect the interests of DHSC. So the key takeaway is ultimately from this policy, there's a significantly more amount of transparency. You can see the expectations on the consent process and you have clarity on what the revenue sharing terms are going to be. We believe this will result in fast transactions as 80% of consents based on what we can see in our portfolio should go down the automated approach. We've unified with BRC accounting methods, so there's not this duplication of work and having to dig out really old use of funds from NHS institutions. And we've got pre-approval for transactions, so you don't have to wait for DHS to approve reinvestment locally, and it massively favours institutions in that sense. Specifically for TTOs, the ability to retain and redeploy those revenues into research in the majority of cases is very beneficial. We've got flexibility built in the case that funders' terms clash. You've got flexibility on the TTO fees, and ultimately you've got less bureaucracy and lower hurdles for commercialization. So in terms of our policy rollout, we've got a 3-stage plan. As we roll out, what we really want to be doing is speaking to TTOs locally, speaking to institutions locally, and understanding how the policy works in the real world. Your feedback is key for us to continue developing this policy and make it as pragmatic as possible. We started a few weeks ago with initial external stakeholder trainings with BRC managers, with BRC directors. We're speaking with UKRD later this week. I'm speaking with yourselves at KUK now. The official policy launch was yesterday, so the educational materials are now available on the website. The use of the automated pathway is now feasible, and our consent form will be available if you want to reach out to us, and we can share that with you. In terms of the long-term plan now, we've launched a troubleshooting and feedback inbox. So if you have if you want to share opinions on the policy, if you want to share feedback on its use in real cases, you can reach out to us either via the inbox or via our email, which we will share with you later. And essentially, we are going to bring together the feedback that we get from the first 2 months of use of this policy and produce a set of roundtables with external stakeholders to go through and reassess how well it's working in the real world, and to go through and assess potential solutions to issues that arise. Ultimately, we want this policy to work in the real world, as we said, and key to doing that is understanding the local implications. So again, this is a starting point, and as Mark said, it is a step change, but it's one that we want to continue developing. So it's really key that please come and tell us when things don't work. Please come and tell us when you have opinions on how things could work better, and we will work with you locally to make this as pragmatic and useful policy as possible. So I'll stop there. Very happy to take any questions, but yeah, thank you again for coming and listening.
Thanks, Daniel. Mark, I don't know if you've got anything else you want to say. Do be aware we can take questions later. So if you do have questions, either post them in the chat or be forming them to post to the team. Mark?
Nothing to add straight away. I do appreciate that some people may have found the sound quality not perfect. So I think the captions did help a little. If the recording ends up being equally difficult to hear, Daniel, sorry, I'm going to put more work on you. Daniel will re-record the presentation itself, and we will hand it over for uploading. And we will make sure that there is a recording which is more easily to listen to if it is problematic. I just wanted to say that too.
Thank you, Mark. So if you do have questions, do feel free to post them in the chat. I think you can raise your hand and pose them directly. Just a couple of questions from me. One is around the educational materials. I presume we can sort of signpost to where those materials may be found so that you can pick them up. And then secondly, you talked about the potential for roundtables post-launch to sort of finesse the policy. Can you talk a little bit more about how those roundtables might work, when they might be, how people might put their hand up to be involved in those?
I haven't read it.
Yeah, sure. So we can circulate the website, the link shortly after. So the policy is now available on the NIHR website, and we also have a number of assumed. Obviously, we haven't had many questions yet. Frequently asked questions to answer questions that might arise about the policy. In terms of the roundtables, yeah. So we're hosting roundtables at the end of September, the start of October. This will be primarily inviting individuals who've been engaged with us throughout the consultation process. But if individuals have particular interest in feeding back into this policy, we're very open to receiving that feedback and potentially inviting others to join us for that event as well.
Thank you, Daniel. We've got one question from Emma, which is, can you expand upon what's meant by the funder contribution, perhaps with an example? And how that will work and what that will mean for NIHR.
Yeah, sure. So the funder's contribution is the financial contribution that's been made to the research. So in most cases, that's a contract of funding, say from one of our HTA programs or our Invention for Innovation programs, that's gone into creating the intellectual property that then goes on to be commercialized.
That's me slow on demuting my microphone. Thank you. I'm aware that you're posting questions that we can see and you can't see as audience members. So I will flag them to the team, but the panelists can see the questions that I'm going to. So Claire Arkwright has asked, what happens with cases that are already being negotiated with NIHR that were in flight before this policy was announced? When does the new policy take effect?
Sure. So we're very happy to backdate this policy if that works better for local institutions. So if you've got a pile of cases that you are still trying to push through, we're very happy to push back the policy and apply these terms as necessary.
So that's down to individual institutions coming to you and saying, we've got something in flight, either we'd like to carry on as we are, or we'd like to switch to the new policy. And you'd like institutions to come to you and have a discussion about which way to deal with those cases.
Absolutely. It goes both ways. So going forwards, as we roll this out, you don't have to take the automated approach is the key new mechanism. You don't have to take that approach if you don't want to as we launch this. But also similarly going backwards, if you want to apply it to old cases, you can also do that if they haven't been fully signed off yet.
Okay. So hopefully that provides some clarity, Claire. I see a question from Tony Raven. So how does this policy work with TTOs using subsidiary companies to meet their charitable requirement re-commercial activities? The normal way around the company having to pay corporation tax on transferring revenue to the university is to make it an unhypothecated gift. This would seem to make it a hypothecated gift, which would be subject to CT. Do any of the team want to comment on how this works for subsidiary companies and their normal way of dealing with commercial activities?
Sorry, Daniel. Can I just say something quickly? I think without this being a direct analogy, but when I was working in tech transfer many, many years ago, we were often asked by academics about their tax situation when it came to all sorts of things. I don't think we can necessarily answer tax-related questions. It is an interesting one, Tony, and I personally, maybe Daniel and James do have an answer to it, but I wonder whether that is something which is for the university and TTO to investigate first, rather than us accidentally give tax advice without actually having the expertise to do so. I may have misunderstood the question, Tony, so apologies.
And I guess that may be a useful topic to bring up at one of those roundtables in a bit more detail, around how that sort of scenario works and how that plays out. Just again, for the panelists' benefit, we also have questions in the Q&A box. So certain people are sending questions direct to the panelists, which I'm reading out so that everybody's aware of them, and certain are coming in the Q&A box. So one of those questions is, how does this affect higher education institutions and NHS organisations in Scotland, as some calls are not available to Scotland? So what's the implication for devolved nations?
Yeah, this policy is applicable to devolved nations as well. So it's going to be applied to all NIHR research contracts.
Thank you. So there are no open questions, but we're happy to take questions on some of the details of this, either through either of those routes. At the moment, I think we've answered most of those that have come in, but happy to take further questions.
I can see there's a couple on the funder contribution times 50%. Maybe I can answer that. So that's essentially explaining what the formula is for calculating the revenue share. So the example is, if the NIHR funds absolutely everything, the net financial return for the NIHR would be 50%. If it only funded half of things, it would be 25%. That makes sense. So it goes down from there. And that's after top slicing any TTO fees and eligible deductions for direct costs of commercialization. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you for picking that up. So yeah, so if you do want to post any more questions, do Mark, Daniel, James, if there's anything you want to say just broadly in response to where those topics are coming up in terms of how things, and we've got a couple more coming in too. So Daniel's just posted a link, and we've got a question about what is the half of what profit or income, and you've responded to that, I think, Daniel.
Confusingly, I've said a different word, income. So that's revenue or income for the licensor in that instance.
Thank you. So this is fun having them come from two areas, one where people can see and one where people can't. So in the public forum, does it mean NIHR will accept the set TTO fees if justified? And will that flexibility apply equally to automated and case-by-case routes?
So case by case, there's no template. So we can discuss that on as it says, a case by case basis. With the terms of the TTO fees, if that is your institutional set position, we're happy for that to be the justification. For that to be the position of reasonableness.
Thank you, Daniel. So going to the sort of private question box, Katie asks, where does the inventor's revenue share come into those stages?
Sure. So the way we envision this, again, so if you imagine the scenario where the NIHR has funded everything, the NIHR will be getting 50% of the net revenue. The other 50% is for the institution. It's within that share that the inventor's shares are then divided up. And that can be purely at the discretion of the institution as to how they do that. I know you all have very different policies on that.
Thank you, Daniel. Claire has put in the private question box, are there restrictions on how HEIs can use the retained funds? What are the restrictions around the use of retained funds?
So the ask is that the funds are used for further health and social care research, We will be asking that a high-level plan is set out, and we will put in place a period of sort of annual, or a plan for annual reporting on the use of those funds.
Thank you. At the moment, I think we've answered most of the questions that come in. There's just been another one. I'm just going to give another few coming in. I'm just going to give Mark a heads up that when we draw a close to the Q&A, I'll just ask you to sort of summarize the main points that you want people to go away with in terms of how they can get in contact. So I'll just flag that now, but we've got questions coming in. So post-launch, this is in the private question box, post-launch, will you publish aggregate data on how many cases followed the automated versus the case-by-case route and the average consent turnaround time? So will you sort of publish data on how it's going with those two routes?
I'd like to. That makes no sense. We haven't confirmed whether or not we'll do that yet, so we'd have to get back to you on that point.
Thank you. So a question for them to go away with in terms of how you report back on how that's working. Again, in the private box from Tony Raven, for spin-outs, is it a share of the equity or a share of the equity realizations at exit that you are considering?
That will be a share of the equity realization at exit. At the moment, the NIHR has no capacity to hold equity.
Thank you. And then back to the 50% share for clarity. So to clarify, the remaining 50% share that the HEI receives does not have restrictions about how this can be allocated. It's up to the HEI's policy. Confirming. So Daniel's confirming that's the case. So thank you for that clarification, Katie. Hopefully that.
Sorry, just a quick point on that one. It will be sort of within the area of health and social care research, though we would expect that it was reinvested into further health and social care research. That would be the sort of limit of the restriction, though.
Thank you. So lots of sense. Going across to the public questions. So does it mean the NIHR will accept the set TTO's fees if justified? And will that flexibility apply equally? So we've answered that one, apologies. How will the revenue share policy apply to equity shares in spin-outs? Which I think we've sort of partly covered, but feel free to speak to revenue share policy applying to equity shares in spin-outs.
Sure. So the revenue sharing that comes in the case of spin-outs is with regards to all of the revenue that the spinning out institution would receive. So that would be any license that exists and any realization from sale of equity in the future.
Thank you. So again, we've got a pause on questions, which is fine. I'll give a few minutes for more questions to come in. I realise with the nature of this format, questions come in on different topics at different times, and I'm sure the team at NIHR will be working up popular questions into their FAQs that they publish, and sort of reflecting on some of these questions so that they can clarify it in the guidance that they have, if there are helpful kind of comments coming through. No more questions have come in on either of those chat boxes. Oh, just when I say that, there are questions, which is good, which is part of me filling. So we've got a question about, do you have any understanding of other research councils considering implementing similar policies and approaches? So any intel on whether this will lead the pack with other organisations, or any views on that?
I think that what UKRI will be doing will be culturally different, that they may want the same end result of innovation back into the system, but by definition they're an arm's length body, so the vast majority of this stuff will have a different lens, if I can use that particular term. And just very quickly, the new IP team at NIHR, they're really quite excellent. I'm not just saying that for effect, but they really are. But they're also very approachable. So with any format like this, where we give a presentation and it's 45 minutes, there will be things that occur to you guys, obviously, after this meeting, days, weeks, months ahead. Drop them a line. They're based around the country anyway. They all really like coffee. And you know, I would heartily recommend that you talk to them. They're quite lovely people. So sorry, I just thought I'd interject that in case we did run out of time, even though we do have 15 minutes left. Stuart, back to you.
No, I think that's really helpful. So this is the start of a process that you very helpfully laid out in terms of launching the policy on August the 11th, and then post policy launch back and forth with those roundtables. So that reminder that the team are approachable and wanting to sort of engage with people who have to use this policy and engage with this policy. And obviously in this format we can ask various questions and we can share it, but other things will crop up. One other question has come in about revenue share agreements and will they be executed for each case? So a question from Claire about will a revenue share agreement be executed for each case?
So the 30-day time limit is for the agreement of the financial terms that will go into the revenue sharing agreement. If it's the preference or if the institution isn't ready to execute that agreement, we don't have to execute it right then and there. We can be flexible with that. But if you go down the automated route, it's the expectation that revenue sharing terms will be set out based on the set term framework.
Smashing, thank you. So I'll just give a few more seconds for other questions to come in, with that reminder that this is an ongoing process. This isn't a one chance to ask questions, but an ongoing chance to sort of work through with the team. And if there aren't any more questions in the next few seconds, I might just ask Mark to just give us the headlines again of it's been very helpful for you to outline why this has come about, what the drivers are, what the policy is, and what happens going forward. In my filling for time, one other question has come in, so I'll pose you that. That's in the open question box. Do you expect universities to hold equity on NIHR's behalf until exit if you cannot hold this yourself? So Daniel, you said you can't hold equity. So do you expect universities to hold equity on your behalf?
So from it depends how you view it. You could view it as holding equity on our behalf. From our perspective, we see it as we are sharing the revenue that results from the equity that you hold. Yeah, there's nuance around that.
And we've got another question in the private chat, which I'll read out, and Daniel, you can reflect on it. It's about clarification. So thank you for the clarifications on James's response. So we might want to talk about James's response because that was in the private chat. So to be clear, the NHR revenue share that would be reinvested into further HSC funding, would this be research only at the partner HEI or any HEI? So James, do you want to explain the clarification that you made to Katie following Katie's question, and then perhaps respond to the sort of further clarification?
Yeah, so the clarification I made was around the 50% share. So if there would be 50% for the institution and 50% for NIHR. So NIHR's share is to be reinvested into further health and social care research, and then the 50% that is sort of directly back to the institution anyway. NIHR wouldn't have any sort of say or look to impose any restrictions on that. So there's been a further question on whether the NIHR revenue share that would be reinvested into further health and social care funding, would this be research only at the partner HEI or any HEI? So I think at this point, we're happy to sort of take proposals on what that would look like, and that can be sort of determined closer to the time where relevant. It's difficult to give any answers, I suppose, without any real further detail, but we sort of just expect that it is reinvested within the HEI as appropriate.
Thank you. So again, we'll see another question has come into the private chat box, which I'll read out so that you can reflect on it. So from Tony again, how would this work with third-party arrangements which have rights already to revenue share, e.g. university-linked investment funds that already take half of any university equity? So when there's already a call on university equity, how would that work?
So the NIHR revenue share does only sort of pertain to the relative proportion of NIHR funding. So I'm not sure if that answers the question directly, but I suppose it doesn't have any bearing on the third parties arrangements that are pre-existing. As Daniel mentioned, though, within the actual presentation, that where the retention of for the university is looking like its obligations to other sort of third parties or funders is going to take more than 50% of that actual money to directly back to the university, then there is flex in the policy there.
Sure. So again, there's a follow-up. The problem is not that they are not funders of the research, but of the spin out.
So typically the way the revenue sharing will work as it pertains to spin outs is that the revenue sharing agreement will be with the university and in relation to the actual license between the university and the spin out, as opposed to with the spin out itself.
So I think with this one, Tony, if you wanted to come back to the team directly and get into the weeds of that, I think that might be a sort of helpful way to take that forward, and then perhaps the team can communicate the sort of outworkings of that more broadly. So
yeah, sorry, Stuart, just to
go
say
for it,
that
James.
we're happy to take questions offline, and our team inbox, the email address is ip.unit@nihr.ac.uk. I'm not sure, Stuart, if we can sort of put that in a Q&A or chat anywhere that's available to all of the participants.
So that's been put in the chat, but I think you're posting it to the hosts and panelists. So we can make sure that goes into the information around the seminar, both online. But just for those listening, that's ip.unit@nihr.ac.uk. We have one other question from the RANG around the money. Will the money replace an equal amount of your budget from government or be on top of it? So there's a question about the money flows that's in the sort of chats to hosts and panelists. Who'd like to respond to that one?
So can we unpack that question a little?
So if the representative from RAN just wants to either post to everyone or in the private chat a clarification of that question, then that will probably help Mark to give a better answer to that. I'm aware that the clock is ticking, which is fine. So what I might do, will the funds increase your budget?
Okay, so in the vast majority of cases, so again, we think 80% are going to go down the automated approach. The NIHR's revenue that comes from the revenue share agreement will be held locally and reinvested. So that doesn't go back into our budget. That goes out into the research ecosystem. We want to know how it's spent. We will be putting in reporting in place, but ultimately that goes into the research ecosystem to support institutions. In terms of revenue that goes down the case-by-case pathway, that may still be reinvested locally. But again, it depends on the whether it's value for money for us to take it back internally and set up a whole new fund, a whole new program, a whole new investment case with it. So that will be done on a case-by-case basis. But for the majority of cases, no, the funds aren't coming back. They're staying in the local ecosystem for further health and social care research.
And Daniel, I'm trying to guess whether there's an under question there. I think there's a concern that if people make money from intellectual property, their research budget gets reduced because they've made money out of IP. I'm wondering whether that's the under question, so to speak, which is not really the point. It's not really the point around the new policy. So if that was the worry, gosh, if we're successful, we make loads and loads of money. The next research thing we get back. Oh, fine. Apologies. RANG Enterprise Hub. That's me overanalyzing your question.
So they commented back. They're just interested if this will create a feedback loop for growth. So that was the question behind the question. I think what I'm going to do at that point is thank everybody for their questions. Apologies that some of them have been in the private chat rather than the Q&A. but hopefully both me reading them out and the team's responses are helpful. So what we will do is I'll hand over to Mark in a second just to point out those headlines of the policy, why it's come about, the key things to bear in mind. And he will inevitably stress the team is approachable to follow up with questions. And as we get into the detail of how this policy works out, that the joy of having James and Daniel on screen is that you've got a face that behind an email address, and others around that too, to be able to sort of follow up with questions. So Mark, over to you just to sort of some concluding comments.
Thank you, Stuart. Much appreciated. So the key takeaways basically are we're hoping that there should be greater transparency as we implement the policy. Part of the roundtables approach and the ongoing conversation is to make sure it's implemented in the way which does help support that greater transparency. Clear expectations on the consent process, better clarity on the revenue sharing terms. We're hoping that it speeds up the process and reduces the bureaucracy, because we expect that 80% of the consents will take the automated approach as outlined by Daniel. It'll unify the biomedical research center accounting methods, and hopefully will create a pre-approved transactions to reduce wait time in the majority of circumstances. When it comes to the benefits to the TTOs institutions, we expect this will create an ability to retain and redeploy NHR revenues into research for the majority of cases. A level of flexibility in case there's a clash between funders' terms and the TTO fees. But overall, as I said, less bureaucracy and lowering of hurdles for commercialization. But I'll rehead again. Please talk to us. Please talk to Daniel and James and the rest of the team. If possible, I said, try and grab them to a coffee. I love online. Online's fabulous, but it's amazing how much more understanding can be created over a cup of a hot drink. When we understand each other better. Some of the questions, as I said, I was already trying to interpret the under question. That sort of stuff disappears when you get to know people an awful lot better. So I do really hope that the dialogue continues, the coffee continues, and that when we run roundtables, I hope to see some of you at a later date. Stuart, back to you to wrap up.
Thank you, Mark. There's a couple of questions to one question coming from Portsmouth, which we'll make sure that Daniel and James can respond to by that route that Mark has suggested, either by email or coffee. Thank you, Daniel, Mark, James, for giving your time, for your keenness to make sure that people understand the policy, they understand the people who are behind it, so that they can ask questions. We really appreciate your time and look forward to members of KUK participating in those roundtables in due course. Thank you, everybody, for your time this morning.